Welcome, everybody. We are really excited to have you here with us today. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for SACE. I will be the facilitator for today's webinar, Demystifying the Value of Solar. On behalf of SACE, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Your interest and support make our work possible. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. SACE has been a leading voice for energy policy to protect the quality of life and treasured places in the Southeast since 1985. We are a membership organization, and we do have SACE members here on our call today, so I just wanted to thank you so much for your support and encourage those of you who are not members to join us today. We will be recording this webinar, so all the lines have been muted to assure recording quality. I encourage you to type in your questions during the presentation using the questions option on your control panel. We will then answer the questions at the very end of the presentation. The recording will also be available on our website, cleanenergy.org. And now I'd like to turn it over to SACE Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Smith.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is going to be a really interesting webinar. We're excited about it. It's timely. For those of you who are paying attention to the industry, I think you have probably noticed a fairly significant uptick in the heated debate over solar power and its value to electrical systems. There seems to be almost a coordinated attack at some level going on about things like net metering and what is the role of solar on the system and what are the true costs that people who are participating with solar on electrical systems are providing. So this is a very timely and useful conversation. And in that context, it was my pleasure to be able to reconnect with an old friend, Carl Robdigo. Carl and I worked together years ago on the Center for Resource Solutions board around green power pricing programs. Carl has a very rich and diverse history. He was at the Department of Energy, where he was the secretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Utility Technologies, and at the Department of Energy. He's also been a commissioner on the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and most recently he was the Vice President of Distributed Energy Services for Austin Energy. And it was at Austin that Carl began to really work with the concept of value of solar and bring it forth to a level of sophistication that has actually been rolled out with great success in Austin. So I look forward to hearing his comments, and Carl, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be working with you again, and on, like you said, an important and timely issue. What I'm going to do over the next 30 or so minutes during the time that I talk is go over the idea of the value of solar tariff. It's labeled here, as you can see, as a kind of an alternative to net metering, an advancement, in some ways improvements on net metering, a way to try to rationalize the increasing presence of distributed solar technology into our modern electric grids. With that in mind, I will basically take you through a walk of what ideas went into crafting the value of solar tariff and using the solar valuation study idea, how it differs and from traditional net metering and other forms of solar tariffs, and raise with you some of the many questions and issues that have arisen as I've been talking about this and as the tariff has been implemented at Austin Energy. I left Austin Energy a little over a year ago, and have been pleased to see them continue the work there, but have had an opportunity to be involved in other forums. The value of solar tariff idea is now in Minnesota law, and we've been talking about it in several states in the Southeast and other places around the country. So with that said, let's get started here. Let me start by telling you a little bit of the story of what was going on. Austin Energy, as a result of its many years of aggressive energy efficiency programs and successful energy efficiency programs, was actually able to delay having a base rate case for 17 years. But the time had finally come while I was at Austin Energy, and everything was on the table. At the same time, I had been running a distributed solar program, residential, commercial, as well as a municipal solar program. We were the city's energy manager as the municipal utility. And we thought it would be a good time to take a fresh look at how we were interacting with our solar customers, our solar empowered customers. The issue in front of us was much like the issues you hear about in the media, that we were starting to see a wide, intentionally wide geographic presence of solar in our community. When I was there, first started there, I think we had a little over 500 solar systems. A few years later, when I left, we had about 1,000. Now there's 2,500 solar systems in the city of Austin, a city of about 1 million. We were starting to see increasing popularity as well and falling prices. And as a utility executive, we were starting to confront this idea that of the distributed solar is our dream and our nightmare. It was definitely our renewable resource, and we had a commitment to doing a lot of it, but it also raised all those issues of network charges and fairness to all customers. So the opportunity of a rate case was the moment for us to sit down and say, well, if we were able to design the ideal solar tariff from the ground up, what would we have in mind? And I'm a big believer in sort of the vision and goals thing. And so we sat down, me and my staff, and decided that these were the parameters that we would try to design around. Obvious fairness to utility, the solar customers and the non-solar customers. We realized that from an economic efficiency point of view that we should try to get to fair compensation for solar customers, because if we undercompensated them or overcompensated them for the value of what they were bringing to the system, that would create an economic distortion. And utilities are about economic efficiency and trying to be, and reasonableness. So we thought that getting the right compensation for solar was a key parameter. We had also seen the problem that compensation for solar creation, solar energy creation, generation, was intermixed and intertwined with incentives in such a way that it made it difficult to manage one separately from the others. You've all seen this sort of situation where you have these boom and bust cycles in solar programs where compensation incentives are tied together, and when the incentives run out, the market dries up instead of just slowing down. We wanted to have those separate so that we could deal with them separately. We also started to see the emergence of an odd little problem that some of our solar customers were actually substantially increasing their electricity use because of a partly psychological effect of believing they were getting free electricity. They also realized that under traditional net metering, their solar was worth more to them if they used more electricity during the time that the solar unit was generating electricity. So we had a kind of an odd result that net metering customers were increasing consumption, which was at odds with our traditional energy efficiency objectives. And then finally, like any good rate, we wanted to have transparency, something simple, something clear, something easy for people to understand that would support the market as opposed to dictating it. With those ideas in mind, we kind of got to work. We were not completely writing on a clean slate, of course. Everybody who understands the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, PURPA, knows that it is the groundwork for the idea of net metering, as well as standard offer contracts, for example, to qualifying facilities, feed-in tariffs, and other such structures. It's the law and its associated regulations are the basis for saying that customers can self-generate primarily for their own consumption, and that they are entitled to certain fair compensation when they export to the grid. We have had for decades in this country, and some of us are old enough to go back to the days of the debates about externalities. They still exist. The idea that the pricing for some goods and services doesn't capture all of the costs or benefits of those goods and services, and that leads to a distortive effect on the optimal level of consumption. We understand that price does not equal cost, that sometimes we pay an awful lot for things that are not worth much, and vice versa. We have for several years in this country been doing green power, recognizing the concept that some customers prefer to have more green power and are willing to pay for it, that it is a premium value product, and that pricing, in fact, can properly recognize that. Back when I was at Rocky Mountain Institute, about 15 years ago almost now, we published a book that actually tried to lay out all the costs and benefits of distributed energy resources of all kinds called Small is Profitable. It was on that foundation that some of the value of solar work, first one in this country, was actually built a few years later by people like Tom Hoff from Clean Power Research and Ed Smeloff, at that time formerly as SMUD, then working with the Boat Solar Initiative. And then finally, once upon a time, when we first were bringing integrated resource planning into the electric utility sector, we also increasingly talked about local integrated resource planning to account for the emergence of distributed energy resources, trying to understand the unique characteristics of a more diverse set of resources that includes not just distributed solar, but things like fuel cells and energy efficiency, demand response, curtailment markets, and a whole range of other resources that are available at what RMI calls the distribution edge. So we have a historical platform, we had an idealistic objective of what we were going to do. The thing to do then was to compare what we were doing. I think everybody's familiar with the basic structure of a net metering tariff or a net metering rate. And it basically pays a customer for, at retail value, whatever that retail value is, in an offset fashion, a credit fashion, for their consumption. And then if the solar system generates in excess to that consumption level, they are paid a retail rate, they're paid an avoided cost or a fuel factor or an average class rate or retail rate in some fashion. But there's a break point at the point of consumption where things are seen differently between consumption and export to the grid. And in many places that there is a difference. For example, excess production may be credited net of consumer charges in some places, or these other examples that I've used here. So there's a change point, and if that change is dramatic, that effect that I mentioned earlier on is of customers understanding that it's more valuable to consume when their solar system is generating becomes more pronounced. On the other hand, from the traditional net metering, we switched, let me go through some more of those issues before I switch tracks here. I mentioned the idea of that compensation rate, and I mentioned earlier on that net metering sort of has as an antecedent its PURPA legacy. There is some concern that as solar gets less expensive and more affordable, that customers will build larger systems. And if they build larger systems because they're more affordable, they could eventually work themselves completely out of paying any bill to the utility whatsoever. This gives rise to the argument that there might be a cross-subsidy flow between the some customers without solar and those with. A couple of important things to understand about that that we could go into later on. It has to do with forecasting and whether the impacts are between rate cases or permanent. But there is that concern that comes up. There's also, at the very heart of it, if you're a regulatory geek like me and you believe that rates should be cost-based, based on true sort of cost of service studies, there is a kind of a nagging concern that while net metering was a convenient structure in that it pegged solar compensation as equivalent to the retail rate, it wasn't really based on any particular study. It wasn't based on the fact that that's how much it cost, that's how much the solar is worth. It's just it was actually a convenience that probably has as much to do with the fact that old mechanical meters could spin in one direction or the other. And that by removing the detent in those old meters, a solar customer could achieve the benefit of net metering, which is really how the concept was born. In places, going down to the bullet now here about low payments, in places where there is a significant drop off in the credit or the payment for exported energy or excess energy, we've started to see a couple of pretty significant effects in the distributed solar marketplace. First of all, it has an effect of reducing the optimal investment size. Well, actually, first of all, is the encouragement of consumption during periods of solar production. I already talked about that. But another point I want to make is this reduction in the optimal investment size. The point there is that distributed solar systems and installations and the business is generally a pretty high fixed cost business. If you can imagine what it takes to make a solar system move from concept to installation, there are consultations, there are calculations, there are designs, drawings, there are permits, There are getting crews to the site and the equipment necessary to install the equipment. There is an inverter, usually sized for a range of different kilowatt sizes. So you have a pretty high fixed cost component. But where there's merely an avoided cost compensation for excess production, there's a strong incentive to never design your solar system bigger than your average baseload consumption. That's simply because solar has a pretty high capacity cost since it's by the nature of the technology. And a significant drop-off in compensation will lead, or the failure to carry credits forward through the course of a year, or any other features of some net metering programs for that matter, those factors will cause you to not put on a solar system that's as big as it could be for maximizing the economic benefit. In addition, the sort of idea of designing a solar system to never export because it's never worth it denies the opportunity of having valuable peak period or close to peak energy generated by these systems that may actually be used by the utility just to serve a nearby customer. So there's an economic opportunity cost associated with the rules that keeps systems a little smaller under many net metering systems. If the true-up period, as I just mentioned, is monthly, then you'll have suboptimal sizing again. And again, that's a suboptimal investment per install. And then the last point here I'll make here is that there's a lot of utilities that are finally starting to look into inverted block rates or tiered rates, as they are called more commonly these days. The idea that if you are a bigger consumer, your rate is higher because your cost of service is generally higher. Well, there's a kind of an inverse perverse relationship with net metering in that it actually encourages customers to use more electricity so they can get into a higher tier so they can get more value for their solar and their payback would be higher. And as I said, for Austin, and I think for most people, that's antithetical to the idea of trying to be as efficient with our use of energy as we possibly can. So those are some of the issues that are associated with a very good model that is at work in well over 40 states in our country and has done a great deal to advance solar, but wasn't specifically designed with solar in mind, and possibly has some room for improvement. That's where we like looking at Austin Energy. So what we had around us, and in fact at Austin we had before us for several years, was an analytical approach that tried to calculate the value to the utility of solar. Our goal in conducting our value of solar studies, which I'll describe, was really just about trying to find the indifference value, the kind of the pivot point at which the utility could build the solar or the customer could do the solar, and the economic difference would be zero between those two. So if you can imagine, if you can find out what that solar is worth, you can actually get an awful lot of use out of it. At Austin Energy, we first contracted with Clean Power Research people to conduct our value of solar study before I even got there, back in 2006, because we were starting to get approached by large-scale solar developers who wanted to offer us their solar output. We could do a traditional RFP to choose the lowest price solar that anyone would offer, but we didn't really have any objective indicator of whether that low price was a good price, whether it was a good value to our customers. So conducting this value of solar study to really look at what solar is worth when installed in the distribution grid, this calculation attempts to come up with that number. Think of it as an avoided cost with repetition over the many years that a solar system operates, a full avoided cost with a levelization, much like the analysis that many utility people are familiar with when they do integrated resource plans, trying to come up with a long-term levelized resource value, summing all the costs and benefits, so you know whether or not it's a good investment decision. That's the number we were trying to get. So we did that for reasons that didn't have anything to do with our retail rate. And in fact, when I joined Austin Energy, I saw that we were conducting this updated annual value of solar study and realized that I could use that same number to help benchmark my rebates and incentives. Those also were a Goldilocks type idea, where you try to get the price just right when you're paying out incentives. And understanding what solar is worth is really, really helpful when you're setting a good incentive that pays enough to get a customer to do the solar, but not so much that it becomes a free rider situation. Finally, a couple of years ago, when we were doing the rate case, as I said at the start, we looked at the value of solar and said, hey, maybe we can use this for the rate. So what is in the analysis? Well, you can see here, it's a list. You basically pry it apart, completely unbundle it, use your different analytical tools to look at the various components, or as Rocky Mountain Institute would call it, services, that a distributed solar system requires, and in some cases needs, to come up with the costs and benefits. It's more than just the energy, and even more than just a sort of a one-year annualized capacity value, as you might see calculated, for example, in an avoided cost case. But you're also trying to pick up the value of transmission. Moving the energy on a regular basis, as well as the long-term capacity issues. Same for distribution. Line losses, because this model delivers its energy at or near the point of consumption, are a big difference, worth about 7% in some places, more in other countries. We knew at Austin Energy that we were hedging our fuel prices, and that solar did not require that hedge, so there was a savings there. Plus, customers had already demonstrated with Austin Energy's award-winning Green Choice program that they had a preference for green, so we could use the price that was customers were willing to pay there to come up with an estimate of the willingness to pay value of solar distributed in the system. And then there's a host of other factors that are also very real, which may or may not be easy to quantify or appropriately fit into a rate, but as I said, they are real and oftentimes can be twice the utility rate value. Those are things like the value of local jobs and economic development, local tax revenues associated with the business, and sometimes called externalities or societal value, but they are real. And when you're a municipal utility, I think when you're any kind of utility, there isn't really a distinction between customers as utility customers and customers as citizens. So it's appropriate to consider these factors when looking at a program. So those are the ideas behind taking an analytical approach as opposed to sort of an assignment of value approach as in net metering. Rocky Mountain Institute breaks these services down here on slide 6 in a way that is, I think, a helpful categorization. And you can see some examples of the sub-elements on this slide. I want to bring this to you for, if no other reason, also to mention that the eLab, a project of Rocky Mountain Institute, has published a study on the value of solar PV, which looks at about 15 of the solar value studies that are published out there and well known. Some cautions later on, but all the studies seem to have been done for a different purpose. So apples to apples comparisons are not that common between them, but there is a holistic reality to the idea of trying to capture all of these values, again, in order to make economically efficient decisions about a program or about a rate. On the next slide, just to add a picture effect to that flow of services, the benefits and costs as I described them, you get an idea here that one of the important things in considering how to fairly compensate and count the costs and benefits of solar depends on where you draw your circles and what you draw into your circles and what you draw outside of your circles. And apologies here to the solar providers. I know they're very much a part of the community. For this analysis, though, these are the relative circles that sort of help you understand where these flows go. And you can see, again, how they're nested and how you can take one view, for example, the avoided costs, and it flows in a particular direction. There's also there are other related flows. They've used here the traditional California standard practice manual type groupings to draw these circles. You'll see terms, if you're familiar with energy efficiency, participant cost, total resource cost, societal cost, utility cost. So there's a strong overlap in cost-benefit analysis and value of solar studies. So again, I'll commend that study to you for your further inquiry. I'm going to get back into the rate ideas here, though, in my presentation. So if on the one hand, you have this net metering situation, and it's got a lot of good things going for it, and you have this analytical approach, which offers the chance to improve things. How can you put those together into a new rate? And I'm really proud to say that it turns out to be kind of a simple thing. The aha moment for us on my team at Austin Energy was to say, hey, instead of using the assigned compensation mechanism of traditional net metering, why don't we use our value of solar as the compensation level? It's what we said was the indifference number. If we annually update it, and make that the payment that's credited, or the value that's credited, not a payment, the value that's credited to customers, then we know that we're compensating them fairly, not overcompensating, not undercompensating them. And then we'll just slightly shift the netting process, if you will, mentally, from the meter to the bill. In essence, you do the summing still, and it still shows up on the customer's premises, at the customer side of the meter. But you basically credit for all the production at the value of solar rate, and then charge the customer, or vice versa, charge the customer for all their consumption on a gross basis, as if they had no solar. So in that way, some pretty amazing things happen by going from this kind of net metering to net billing, but still on the customer's premises. And let's go through some of that. First of all, how does it appear? Well, in the billing, it's pretty simple. You just run through your ordinary charges for your gross consumption. We had 2 meters installed at Austin Energy. Made it very easy to do this because we required a solar meter in order to satisfy our micro generator reporting requirements under the Texas PUC rules. And then you just calculate your solar output from your solar meter, or just input your solar output from your solar meter and pay it as a credit against the currently applicable value of solar rate. So again, the customer is charged for energy consumption as if they did not have a solar system. This ensures that the utility, and remember I was a utility executive when I designed this rate, the utility always has its cost of service covered. And from an accounting point of view, there's always a credit to the utility accounts for that cost of service, regardless of how the solar system performs. So that puts the burden and the onus of keeping the solar system running on the solar customer where it should be. And gives the customer, as I'll point out in a minute, a strong incentive to actually go back to being more energy efficiency. Then you use the value of solar rate, and when I created the tariff, it was designed to be updated on an annual basis. And that way the utility would never be in a position, as could happen, for example, in a feed-in tariff case, of overpaying or underpaying for the solar and having a legacy rate or a legacy award sort of influencing the market conditions. This customer pays the net charges. We move the crediting period from 1 month to 1 year to account for the seasonal differences, and then zeroed those out at the end of the year to help avoid any potential tax issues, any accusation that the solar customer was generating for business. If there's a shortfall or a credit that's excess to the charges for the utility, those excess charges can be flowed through the fuel factor in order to keep the utility whole. And as I said, we sort of do an annual adjustment to the VOS rate to keep things on track, to allow the customers to keep up with the value of their solar faster than would happen when, for example, you have a rate case every 17 years, as would be the case under net metering. So summing up what kind of benefits this creates, well, some of these were clear to see from the very start, and some of these were kind of miraculously wonderful. The first thing was that, as I said, by using this net charging, this sort of gross charging for consumption, and then a fair credit, you reduce or eliminate any objective argument that there's any interclass subsidies going on. The customer is always being charged at their applicable rate for their value. And the utility is kept whole, as I said, especially from an accounting point of view, because they get a credit. In addition, we were conservative in our calculations to make sure there was some slight utility upside so that we would not get into a position of unfair subsidies. This net billing approach reinstalls the incentive for efficiency, which is really powerful. It gives the customer a strong incentive to actually free up more of that on-peak energy for the utilities use and reduce their own consumption simply by changing the way that calculation occurs. The annual adjustment, as I said, prevents over or underpayments. It better aligns with the general concept of sound rate making because it uses a cost basis. And it had the effect of reducing the simple payback in Austin down below 10 years when we first put in the rate, which was one of those important threshold periods. So the quick summary takeaway there is that in the time, in the 6 months before the rate was actually put into effect, but after it was approved by the city council, demand for solar went up so much that they were able to reduce the rebates from $2.50 down to $2. And they subsequently reduced it down another 50 cents. So they've reduced rebates by over a third and the market now has 2,500 solar systems on residential customers' homes, showing strong demand with reduced rebates, which is a good thing if you're a utility. Now, as you look around to people doing these calculations, we've published a lot of information about Austin Energy. Tom Hoff did with Clean Power Research. The studies are available. Other studies have been conducted. Some studies have been conducted by consultants to other utilities, like in Arizona, we're having a debate now about net metering, or in California on review of the California Solar Initiative, and other utilities as well. NV Energy did some a few years ago. And again, several of these are listed in the RMI report. I did want to leave you some cautions about thinking about these studies. And of course, because this is a local generation, local resource issue, the most accurate study is the one that's done with your facts. But the cautions here you need to ask before somebody tells you, well, this is what the value of solar is. These are the kinds of questions you need to ask. Sometimes why you conducted the study, for example, and who it was conducted for is the most important determinant of what kind of information is in there and what kind of issues were addressed. From a timing point of view, annualization, the kind of calculation you do for avoided cost calculations for opportunity energy transactions, is very different from a levelized study that takes into account the long-run benefits of a resource like distributed solar. The levelization approach, in my opinion, is far superior when trying to get a fair calculation of what solar is worth. You need to check out the assumptions. One of the difficult issues a lot of these studies have is that they'll say things like, well, we plan our transmission in 50 megawatt impacts, so distributed solar by definition, or increments, and so distributed solar by definition can never displace transmission. And that's not entirely true or accurate, but if you set it up as an assumption, then you're always going to get to that answer. I showed you the circles of the stakeholder impacts and perspectives. I encourage you to make sure that if you're looking at somebody else's study, ask what perspective they used and how fine was the detail in their study and what kind of models underlie it, because many of these studies are combinations of approaches because they've been put together only really in the last 6 or 7 years. The bottom line is that if you really want to say anything about the value of solar, you need to conduct a study. There are a lot of studies out there. It's a good benchmark. It's useful for a lot of things, but you have to be careful to get all the terms and conditions on the table up front. This is one of those situations where being a municipal utility is very easy for us in Austin Energy because we had, as a regular practice, wide stakeholder engagement with advocates and solar installers and customers and many others in the community, and we're able to benefit from all of their inputs as we went forward. So just as I kind of move to wrapping up here, I want to sort of give you a sense of where does this value of solar rate fit. The one's a little askew there on my slide, sorry about that, but if you think of the value of solar rate, the fair compensation level calculated according to this 30-year stream, et cetera, listed here as sort of the center point, the one value, the purest kind of PURPA, take my excess generation agreement probably ends up costing something to the customer. It's a way to sell excess energy, but it isn't a good way to make a business. Net energy metering, depending on the specific provisions, it goes from anywhere from sort of a 0.5 to a 0.9, depending on the state and the terms. Buy-all, sell-alls, PPAs, and FITs tend to have reach a number that's bigger than the value of solar, and that's simply because they typically are limited in transaction term to like 10 years or something. So you know that if a large developer were coming to you and saying they wanted to sell you their solar, they would calculate the price they offered you in such a way to pay off their investors and recover their investment in a relatively short period of time. Not quite the same as the 30 years that you'll get from a solar system on an individual customer's roof. So the number has to be a little higher. And then if we really calculated the full value of solar and got all those externality values, the economic development, jobs, taxes, health, and security, pretty confident from looking at the research that you're talking about 2 to 5 times sort of the current value of solar, depending on how you count things and what value you put on things like global climate change and other things that don't have strict calculated values in today's marketplace. So that's kind of where it sits, sort of in the sweet spot in my view, and gives you a sense of sort of where things are higher and lower and why they are. What should you do? Well, if you're interested in getting involved in it, as I said before, I think the first thing you should do is do the value of solar analysis. Understand it. Figure out what this stuff is worth before you express an opinion on it. Study it in the context of your system or your state or whatever. Figure out what energy is worth in distribution and transmission and hedging costs and water and the risk of water availability and the risk of fuel availability, the risk of environmental regulation. Come to terms with that, because these are customers installing power plants on the roofs for 30 years, and they're going to be providing value to the system for that long. It's just fair to consider that if you're providing an incentive or encouragement or a policy around that, you should appreciate that full value as well as the full costs that are associated with having these systems as part of the overall electric grid. While you're doing that, you can get some benefits from it, as I said before, to index and improve net metering and evaluate PPA offers and index your incentives. And that'll lead you in a position where you can possibly even imagine adopting the VOS as a tariff form. And then, because we're always getting better at understanding these costs and values, you can continue the effort to improve and make the numbers more precise so that the economic efficiency is likewise improved in the rate structure that you're living with. A lot of questions typically come up. I'm going to assume that some of you would have some of these. Let me just hit on a couple of them that are particularly sort of common here. The first one's kind of an easy one. What about the intermittence of solar? Well, that's taken care of by using a rate that pays for energy. So if you're only paying for the energy and you calculated the capacity value right, you've accounted for that intermittence. This is not about making a capacity payment per se for a resource that isn't available. It's about making energy payments for when the resource is. There's some people concerned that net metering seemed like a stable, something you could understand easily because it was always offsetting the retail rate, and the idea that I talked about changing this and adjusting it on an annual basis makes it less predictable. That's not actually true on the facts because, of course, net metering, the value for your solar could change every time the rate changes. It just seems that in the last few years we haven't had a whole lot of rate changes, but they may be coming up more often. In fact, when you do have a long delay like we had at Austin Energy, you got a real regulatory lag problem. It could be argued that solar customers who had been operating in Austin for 10 years with their solar system with the base rate unchanged were actually not being compensated because those rates should have been higher, and therefore their compensation for their solar should have been higher. In addition, this market should mature, and solar customers, I think, are entitled to sort of participate in the market value of energy more, and this is one way to do it. But finally, the value of solar is not a whip-around number. Using a 30-year levelization structure it tends to sort of dampen down volatility. Are the value components subjective? Well, there are some ways you could add subjective components to them, but most of the core value, I'd say probably 90% of the core value of the value of solar is analyzed using tools that utilities have been using for decades. So we have analytical rigor around those approaches, and they're available. What about lost revenues? Well, that's a whole kettle of fish, and I won't talk about it more, but the tariff design we offered addresses that issue, I think, by doing that gross consumption charge. And then, why do the study results vary so much? And I think I went through that with the cautions. I just want to say that some people say this and some people say that, not because they're trying to say something differently, but because they may have been asking a different question. So it takes a little bit of informed readership when you start reading some of these studies to sort of come to grips with it. And as I said, again, the best way to understand the value of your solar is to calculate the value of your solar. The only thing that will probably get you in trouble in this business is assumptions. With that, let me say thank you all for listening to me go on here. I honored, I think, the time pretty closely, and we can open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, so thanks, Carl. That was very informative. And what I'd like to do is invite Charlie Coggenchild to come on, and he will facilitate the Q&A period. Charlie is our renewable energy manager. Charlie, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Steve. Thanks,
great.
and thanks, Carl. Great presentation. And as Steve said, you guys are allowed, the audience is allowed to submit questions via the GoToWebinar control panel. And I've already got a handful here to get us started, but feel free to keep submitting questions. We should be available to talk for at least 10 or 15 minutes past 2 o'clock. So we'll take as much time as we need up until that point. So already got a few good questions here. One question for you, Carl, is doesn't the variable nature of the value of solar rate create problems for financing options like solar leasing?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I tried to address that a little bit because it's sort of the idea is that, well, first of all, if you're doing solar leasing, if you're dealing with net metering, you still have a core level of variability, right? Because again, the rate of the fuel charge could change, and therefore the implicit value that the customer receives, and their side of the credit mechanism in a lease transaction is just as variable. In fact, it's probably, as I said, it's sort of more subject to a regulatory lag problem. If you think that electricity prices are generally going up, but utilities are generally loath to come in for too many rate cases, then and you're using a historical test year, which is a traditional rate making approach, the value you're getting from net metering is actually going to be less and going to be sort of retarded by that regulatory lag process. Second of all, it's not entirely clear that that the financing, so if you look at the financing stream under a value of solar where you're calculating it with that 30-year levelized price, as I suggested, as we did in Austin, that you're actually going to see any more volatility, and you'll see more upside because you stay truer to the actual costs. But it's also true that this shouldn't pose a huge problem to the customers themselves, right? So this is an issue of whether you can bundle together enough products for the lessors, the guys leasing this stuff. For individual solar customers, the compensation rate is actually improved, so their ability to get a loan should be improved. For the institutional investors who invest in solar leasing companies, I think it's mostly just a matter of communication and explaining that there's already volatility in the net metering. This reduces that volatility and it shortens regulatory lag, so that increases the value proposition to the customer and therefore leaves more room for a more cost-effective lease.
Okay, great. And kind of maybe similar line question here. Any chance such a solar rate structure could be applied to commercial scale solar generation? And they comment that the biggest problem in commercial solar is the lock wholesale electric utilities have on distributors, cooperatives, munis, et cetera, regarding from whom they can purchase electric generation for retail distribution.
Right, that's a couple of questions. So the first one on the commercial thing, there's no reason why the value of solar does not work in a commercial setting. When we instituted in Austin, we had just put in place the PBI, the performance-based incentive, and I was watching the financial sector that lends to to commercial entities, building owners, get itself organized around that PBI, a kind of behind-the-meter FIT structure that we were offering, and didn't want to disrupt that transition. It takes a while for local lenders to, get their underwriting in place and all that stuff. But we could have gone to the value of solar rate for the commercial sector as well. I have a little bit of a feeling that something like a PBI with a 10-year payout might work better for the commercial sector because you've got this nice crisp, you're just multiplying output times your PBI times your years, and you have this nice package of value that can quickly move to a secondary market. We don't quite have those secondary market activities in the residential sector, but I could see the value of having something like that, discrete chunks that are paid out in 10 years on a perhaps accelerated basis. So that's useful. Now, the second part of the question is, how does this interact where you've got something like a G&T, a generation transmission co-op that just sells wholesale, or some distinct wholesale structure from your residential structure, your distribution utility? There's no reason why it couldn't work. What you need to do, though, is have some conversation, because when you do have a distinct separation between generation and distribution, the value of solar comes from both segments, right? And the costs, if you will, are imposed on both segments. So you do need to have some communication across the line. In reality, what would happen is if you do the right value of solar study, you'll actually come up with an improved mechanism because you'll understand how much of the solar is attributable to generation. That's clearly and fairly allocable to the generator. And how much of it is attributable to local distribution. That's fairly attributable to the DISCO. So I actually think undertaking the study would probably improve the quality of relationships between wholesale generators and their distribution companies so that they could really understand what a fair credit was. Then, if you look at the laws, and I know I'm one that's just popping into my head, I know in Minnesota this is how it works. The local DISCOs are entitled to get a credit back from the wholesaler when they have a net metering customer in place. And this would operate the same way, but instead of unfairly allocating distribution savings to the wholesale generator, you'd just be sending the right credits across the lines. So not doing any violence to the separation of the two structures, I think you'd have more economically efficient transactions between those entities as well. And I think in that case, you could add in the customers for an intelligent conversation between the three of them. And you could say, look, I'm saving you this much on this, and I'm saving you this much on this, and that's what it's worth, and let's put the package together. The rest of it is back office settlement like we do with telecom between local and long distance, or bunches of other services like that.
Mm-hmm. And Charlie, I would add, this is Steve, that this is a fundamental question that we're having with TVA right now. We've engaged them in wanting to see them do this type of value solar analysis, and they, as everyone knows, has 155 distribution companies that they're distributing their power through. So stay tuned. We'll keep you updated about whether we can bring the different perspectives together to come up with a value solar rate through the TVA system, because that's one of the larger examples of the question here.
Steve, that's an excellent point. And it also points out that there's a reflection issue here too. Most avoided cost calculations were based on PURPA and based on the idea that we only ever thought that generation would come from these large central station remote plants. So the only thing we ever counted pretty much was energy and capacity. But now we're here dealing with, again, that phrase that RMI uses that I like, the distribution edge. There are a fair few benefits that accrue to the distribution utility from having this kind of generation embedded in their system. FERC, it doesn't have jurisdiction to deal with it. PURPA wasn't designed to deal with it. The federal government doesn't. The local regulators or the local co-op managers, whoever it is, local board managers, are the ones who are supposed to deal with it. It's time we figure it out. So we do need the engagement in that conversation. We need to take this conversation beyond the old avoided cost and say, what does this stuff really bring to us? That's what the valuation concept is about.
And Carl, maybe you can comment too, this is just an insight from me, that on the IREC report about unlocking DG and how maybe there actually are some tools within PURPA to actually develop avoided resource-specific costs for distributed generation. Is that something that you've looked at?
I have, and I know the authors of the report very well, and I'm actually on the board of IREC, so I'm really proud of that report. I think they what they point out, and sort of just to, again, be a little bit of a geek here, but you know what happened was years ago we started having this pretty serious conversation about integrated resource planning and trying to figure out ways to compare all resources on a level playing field so we can make intelligent decisions about what we deploy to provide customers with electric service at the lowest cost. Well, we kind of went into this dereg conversation, and an awful lot of integrated resource planning work kind of got sidelined. And you know, we have these what kind of got frozen into a lot of integrated resource planning processes, I'm afraid, is that instead of actually evaluating the resource, we just conduct an avoided cost as it was done in the early days. Again, energy and capacity. And the state of the art has improved, and this resource is different. So while FERC has continued to make great progress in pointing out the various attributes of generation that can be considered in the wholesale market, and they point out things like, you know, the speed with and modularity with which the generating resource can be built, and environmental benefits. And in the CPUC decision a couple of years ago, they said very clearly that you can even have tiered avoided costs for different kinds of generating resources. Heck, even the recent storage ruling by FERC points out that they're understanding the difference in valuation of resources. So as far as they can go, FERC and the federal courts in affirming their decisions have made it clear that there's pretty good discretion under the Federal Power Act to try to assess these resources as accurately and correctly as possible. But you're still stuck with that one sort of jurisdictional bright line, and the province of retail rates is the states and the utility distribution service providers, whether they're regulated utilities or self-regulating municipals or co-ops. So I think, as I showed like on the continuum, I think you could probably get 90% of the way there with something I would call a true full avoided cost, resource specific. What the value of solar does is says I'm going to expressly, or approach says I'm going to expressly also calculate the local benefits as well as some of the societal benefits that matter so much, where that line between the citizen as customer and the citizen as citizen really disappears.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Here's another question from the audience. Do you recommend replacing net metering with the value of solar rate or keeping both? Does net metering keep the utility honest with value of solar rates because value of solar is a better deal from a utility revenue standpoint?
Right. This is a question we wrestled with a little bit when we were talking in Minnesota when the law was being considered. And they're going to go with it as an option to allow the utility to put into place a value of solar rate if they want to opt away from net metering and start addressing that revenue adjustment mechanism. In Austin, we flash cut everyone over because we didn't want to leave in that residual perverse incentive on the high tiered rates for customers to want to stay on net metering just because they would be in the very high tier if they used a lot of electricity, and sort of gaming the system that way because the rate being set didn't necessarily coincide with the value of solar. It was being set for efficiency purposes. In the end, I think you should probably have one or the other, and I like the idea of getting to value of solar, but I can see having both as a transition under that structure. And again, in Austin, the commercial customers are still on net metering with that behind the meter PBI as the incentive mechanism. I think what's really important is that you try to be express about the structural things you're doing. So try as much as possible in order to facilitate ease of administration and sound policy to decouple the compensation from the incentive so that you can manage those two flows of funds separately. Also, you should try to decouple consumption from compensation because that has perverse effects on what customers do, as I sort of explained. And to the extent that those impacts are remaining in an old structure, you may have to make the transition over. So ultimately, if I was sort of a king of the world, I'd move us all over to a value of solar rate because I think solar is worth more, and because I think it's more fair to compensate fairly, and I think that I'd move on to start looking at the value of storage and the value of security and the value of saving energy and all the other S's that come along with that VOS.
Okay. And here's sort of a technicality type of question about the Austin tariff. The question is, what happens at the year end? Do the credits get wiped out, or is there a payment to the PV owner, I guess, as you transition from one year to the next?
Good question. That actually gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about taxes too. But the one thing we were pretty clear of when we were designing the value of solar tariff was that we were not trying to create a windfall situation. And some net metering systems have actually had this problem, or perceptions or accusations of a windfall, depending on where you sit in the conversation. We were trying to come up with a fair tariff for customers who are primarily offsetting their personal consumption. That, for one reason, we wanted to stay on the clear, bright line, it's kind of fuzzy, of the federal tax law. We wanted to make sure that these were systems that were designed and sized for personal consumption more than for wholesale generation. Just didn't want to get into that business, and we didn't want to inadvertently get our customers into that business. So we looked at what mechanisms would sort of hit the sweet spot between too small, that we thought net metering with avoided cost compensation was doing, versus unlimited. So one of the mechanisms that became really obvious was, and one of our attorneys told us, is that we should not turn the credit, because we ran this as a credit, not a payment, as a bill credit. We should never turn the credit into a payment. And so in that regard, we said that, well, if we take the remaining balance and choose a calendar year at the end of December and take the remaining balance and wipe that out if it's positive, then that basically will sort of put in effect that while encouraging slightly larger systems would not encourage overbuilding, and would support the contention that the customer was building only for consumption and not for wholesale trade. So we felt like we were staying in the right area and because you weren't being paid in cash, it was what they told me was a non-refundable tax credit. I'm not a tax attorney, I'm not giving tax advice, but that would help in our argument that it was primarily for consumption. We had another side issue that was kind of important that we were also concerned with. Solar systems today in Texas enjoy a property tax exemption. And that property tax exemption is written around systems, and this is not a quote, but something to the effect of primarily for consumption on the premises. So we wanted to put in a mechanism that would sort of shave the top off like that, again, to sort of design an incentive for customers to build systems primarily for compensation, but for consumption, I'm sorry, but not overbuild. And our view was that if you want to turn your rooftop into a business, then you're in a different category of customer. And we didn't want to issue 1099s. We wanted to keep it as, again, primarily offset billing for consumption. And that solved a lot of problems at the same time. Also, by choosing the calendar period of December, end of December, we reduced the risk for the legacy customers substantially. In fact, with net metering, there's virtually no risk that they would have any accrued balances at the end of the year. And so it wasn't a burden to the system as I understand it.
Okay. And here we have somebody observed that a value of solar analysis was conducted in San Antonio with CPS, the utility there, and it says it appears they've delayed their value of solar tariff proposal and are talking with stakeholders. Where's this going?
Yeah, that was an interesting one, and I got to be around the periphery. The real players in that are two groups: the CPS Energy, which is a municipal electric utility for San Antonio, and a group called Solar San Antonio, led by Penny Sinkin and then a group of just great folks in San Antonio. What happened was last March, the utility, well, actually it goes back a little further, around last January, the Solar San Antonio had been working with some federal funds on a Sunshot-funded project to conduct a value of solar analysis for San Antonio. They engaged the same people we had engaged, Clean Power Research, and CPS did kind of pulled out of that project, and in March came out and said that they had calculated their own value of solar, and that it was substantially lower than the CPR calculated value. I sat in at least one meeting where CPS said, well, we agree sort of basically on how you got your number and how we got our number, and they said that they basically got their number by using an annualized number, a one-year number that was not based on a confidence that the solar system would be generating year after year, a pretty traditional avoided cost calculation, if you will. The study conducted by the folks at CPR used the same basic approach we did. They were constrained to having used publicly available data and used the 30-year levelized approach. And so for those of you who understand those terms, you'll understand that if you just take a one-year shot at the value, you're going to come up with very different numbers than if you accumulate the 30-year opportunity for a solar system to defray other costs. After a great deal of discussion, and according to at least one report, $6 or $7 million worth of solar installation cancellations or suspensions, CPS volunteered to open a dialogue process with its stakeholders, and so they're now probably around the 6-month point. I haven't seen anything regarding progress there. They promised to come back with something in a year, so I would say start looking in January up until around March to see what those groups are working out.
Okay. And another question here, would such a solar rate structure applied to generating electric utilities provide motivation for that utility to abandon new, possibly dirty and dangerous generation facilities where costs are passed on to ratepayers? So something you might be familiar with if you're working with the utility.
Yeah, you know, there can be no doubt that if the utility can understand that there is service to customers value in making better use of these other resources, that will change the kinds of decisions they make. You know, it's just a matter of, you know, it's sort of like if there's a healthy food alternative on the shelf at the store versus the unhealthy one. And you start reading the labels, you might start choosing the healthy ones. It's really nothing more than that simple of an exercise. So what I find is that the utility people I've talked to who work with this and start thinking, wow, you know, if we come up with fair compensation, we can open the dialogue, for example, to fair compensation going both ways and keeping the utility revenues whole. Then they'll stop thinking of solar as something that they merely subsidize and suffer the existence of, and start thinking about, wow, you know, the number says it's worth something, and I'm really seeing that it's that it could be that the studies tell me it could really help in terms of disaster recovery or resilience to grid fluctuations or whatever the value is. So I think it's sort of a bit of a cybernetic, you know, feedback process in which if you start reading the labels, you might start thinking about it, and then you might start thinking about how you can integrate it into your diet, and then it makes you make healthier choices, and before you know it, you're not stopping off at the, you know, at the bad fast food places often. And that I think, you know, we're all human. It's just a matter of opening your eyes to those options. In some cases, the other big thing is that this enables a conversation between not just the utility and the regulators, but the utility and the regulators and these important stakeholders. And that's always good in the utility sector. It's always good to have outside perspectives, because having been inside so long, I can tell you that sometimes the conversation gets kind of closed. Just case in point was that remarkable result in Georgia, where the local Tea Party came on strong for distributed solar, partly in reaction to the fact that they were being forced to pay QIP for construction work in progress charges for a nuclear power plant that's under construction, and partly because it epitomized the kind of energy independence that synchronized well with their political ideology. Yeah, new ideas are always a good thing.
And I think your mention of Georgia spawned another question. Somebody is familiar, I think, that you had done a testimony there not too long ago. The question is, did Georgia Power do a value of solar analysis to determine the rates they're using in the Advanced Solar Initiative? And if so, how does that differ from Austin?
It's a fun story. First of all, answer the second question first. I don't know how Georgia Power did their analysis in detail to reach the value in the Advanced Solar Initiative. But let me set, for the folks that aren't familiar, let me set the context. Recently, Georgia Power, we may have heard about the decision out of the commission ordering Georgia Power to look at conducting some sort of, or calculating a solar avoided cost or fuller value of solar kind of calculation, adding 525 megawatts, including 125 of those being distributed to its integrated resource plan. That was a separate proceeding, actually separate from the Advanced Solar Initiative, which had been announced by Georgia Power a couple of years before, or a year or so before, which was pretty groundbreaking all by itself. I got to give those guys credit. They put a couple hundred megawatts of utility on the table in Georgia to do solar and surprised us all. We were all, wow, good for them. What happened during the case, and I know because I was being cross-examined on it, which was kind of fun, is that the Georgia Power actually first informed me during the hearing that they had referred to the Austin value of solar approach in reaching their decision that under the Advanced Solar Initiative they would be offering 13 cents per kWh for solar projects that were bid for utility-owned solar. There were the large-scale PPA solar projects. And that made our conversation about getting to value of solar for distributed resources a lot easier. So I don't know how they did it, but they told me and on the record that they used the value of solar idea to try to reach the right price for solar in their initiative. And the one thing I can tell you is that it's clearly different from the avoided cost calculation that's calculated in the traditional approach, because you do have to take account of those realities on the ground at the distribution edge.
So that's a promising revelation from Georgia Power.
Yes.
And actually, just a last question here. It's a fairly general one that you can take any direction you'd like, but it says,
Okay.
What advice would you give to those of us living in states where we don't even have a net metering program, such as Tennessee, and where, for example, TVA has sort of a broken approach to solar?
Wow, yeah, that's a pretty big question. Okay, well, first of all, everything is political, little p, not big P political. Everything is political, right? And it doesn't matter, Georgia and all these other state places have taught us, is it doesn't matter whether you call yourself a Republican or an independent or a Democrat or anything else. What works on the ground is people who are having their energy services met and companies that are serving them in this capitalistic democracy. There's a growing business sort of framework to this that's large to small, and if they're not organized, they need to be organized. Luckily, some of the best work out there is being done by the various state Solar Energy Industry Association or Sustainable Energy Associations who are acting as common gathering points for that, like I said, little p political presence. Second, look for, I owe this one to Ron Lair, an old friend of mine, former regulator out in Colorado. Look for the golden moments. Look for the moments when commissioners are being appointed. You have a right to have a voice in that, to the governor's office if there's an appointment, or when one is being elected, or when a utility is going through an integrated resource plan or a rate case, or is proposing a new program, or is announcing something, and establish a presence and let them know. Sometimes it's not necessarily just bad. It's not necessarily bad will. Utilities take their obligation to serve their customers very seriously, and if they don't hear from them, they do what is working and what addresses the people that they are hearing from. So get yourself into the dialogue. You have an entitled place to be. Third, don't underestimate how seriously utilities take that obligation to serve. There's a lot of trade press going on, I think pretty assumptive and not supported, that distributed solar under net metering is a bad thing because it causes these cross subsidies. My experience with the value of solar analysis is that that's just factually wrong. But imagine you being in the position of being a utility person who's supposed to be and takes a great deal of pride in serving all customers fairly and according to law and process. And then you suddenly hear that this thing you're doing that's growing rapidly is actually being unfair to some of your, in many cases, less well-off customers. Well, that's a conundrum for them, and they need help in understanding why that's not necessarily so, and in thinking through processes that can allow them to maintain their pride in the service they're doing. And then finally, if there's a utility person listening, it's look, read a lot about this. Everybody's talking about it. There's a lot to learn here. The skills that utility people have developed in doing resource planning, in doing long-term planning, going through things like levelized cost of energy studies, and understanding their transmission systems, in coming to grips with things like smart grid and understanding what it really costs to keep this grid running and balanced. All of those are valuable skills in understanding how to make the best use of solar. They could be the best champions for optimizing the use of this valuable resource and for integrating it in a way that provides benefits to all customers. And if they're smart about it, they can figure out how to stay profitable or financially sound why they do it. Everybody's open to the conversation. So broad question, but those are sort of my broad responses.
That's a good one to close on. Well, thank you very much, Carl. It was an excellent presentation, and we had some great questions that you fielded nicely as well. And now I'll hand it back to Aaron for closing it up.
Great. Thanks, Charlie, and thanks to Carl and Steve for being with us today, and all of you for being with us today. We are really excited about our monthly webinar series. It's a great way for us to connect with you, our members and supporters, on the critical issues we care so much about. The recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website, cleanenergy.org, via our webinar archive page. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.